Hello, true duelists. It's YGOstrat's Yu-Gi-Oh! Single Card History, where I'm going to be talking about some of the cards that have impacted Yu-Gi-Oh! Throughout the years, and some of the other ones that didn't. Today's card, the one strong enough to get Yu-Gi-Oh! Players to actually play 60-card decks, it's that Grass Looks Greener. Grass was first released in Raging Tempest in 2017 as a secret rare, and as of this video hasn't received a single reprint. Pretty wild. It has, however, been on the ban list, being limited on the June 2017 ban list for just under a year before it would ultimately be banned on the May 2018 ban list, where as of this video it has been ever since. A normal spell card, its effect reads: if you have more cards in your deck than your opponent does, send cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard so that you have the same number of cards in your deck as your opponent. What a card. The literal mill button of Yu-Gi-Oh! No other card before or since has offered such ample room for graveyard abuse by itself, with only a combination of tier limit names and Ishizu cards really having come close at the time of this video. And Grass does that all by itself, provided that the matchup will allow for it. Grass really is one of the most interesting cards just for how it changed the game in a way no other card did before it, that is, making 60-card decks playable. It released in Raging Tempest, the same set as the format-defining Zodiac cards, and while Zoo would stake its claim in history for its time, Grass was most definitely a part of that history, at least in some way. And the same way Zodiac was in every other deck at the time, a Zoo engine was very common to see in Grass decks. Grass milling more provided you played more cards than the opponent, which meant that you had to put the best sorts of cards in your deck to make it a playable one at 60. So there really wasn't much of a better engine to include in a 60-card deck at the time in 2017 than the Zodiac one. All you had to do was include a playset of Ratpier and a copy of Whiptail, and that way you could use the Rat to cheat out a free rank 4 monster, so to say, and have a Whiptail to give an extra boost of attack as well as a material to the inevitable end of board Trident. And regardless of whether or not a Zoo engine was played in specific, the simple truth is that the first and understandably one of the best decks to use this card was Infernoid. Infernoid monsters all share two key traits, with one exception, the first being a quick effect to tribute a monster and banish a card from the opponent's graveyard, and the second being the summoning condition. All Infernoids, minus Decatron, cannot be normal summoned or set, and instead have to banish one or two Infernoid monsters from the hand or grave in order to summon themselves. So it's not hard to find out why Grass was so good in an Infernoid deck. Not only could it fill the grave with Infernoid monsters to banish, but Infernoid monsters can also summon themselves from the hand or grave by banishing the Noids, so you could summon any of the ones milled as well, offering an abundance of plays. The deck also had received a new trap in Raging Tempest as well, Void Feast, that could let the deck get out 2 copies of Decatron from the deck, which would foolish a copy of Deviati and Anuku each, which meant that the player had a spell and trap negate, a monster negate, and fuel in the graveyard all on top of it. It made for a very strong deck when coupled with the seemingly limitless DD Crows that it had, and when playing against a 40-card deck, if Grass resolved, it felt insanely strong, mostly because it was. While Grass Noids was probably the first one to really abuse Grass, they were far from the only ones doing so. Any deck with effects that worked in the grave would try to be playing Grass, such as Burning Abyss. Who could have seen this coming? Even with limited copies of Graf and Seer, when you're milling up to 20 cards at the start of the duel, it really feels a little unlikely that they won't end up in the grave, doesn't it? The deck was still making the same plays using the Phantom Knight engine it had been since 2016, and of course it could really make use of the Phantom Knight track cards in this build because they all can revive from the grave, and Grass put them in the grave to do so. Not unlike another deck that played traps and milled, but we'll get to that later. Other decks playing Grass included some zombie decks. The likes of Plague Spreader Zombie and Mizuki were already known for their strength in the graveyard, and milling 20 could make for some very strong and abusable plays. Another popular choice was the ever-present Skull Servant deck. Oh, you want a bunch of Skull Servant monsters in the graveyard so you make your king an absolute unit? Say no more. A Skull Servant engine and the Zombie engine are effectively one when played in the same deck, and this was a very fun and reliable deck to play if you weren't really sweating it out. Lightsworn was another deck playing Grass that was popular at the time, and, obvious. Lightsworns already mill for their key strategy, and getting a mill button let the deck really pop off as much as anything else. This was one that really was engine one-shot deck, with multiple good strategies being thrown into one pile of 60 cards to get the most out of it that they could. Brilliant Fusion could send a copy of Trick Clown or Wolf to the grave to give the deck a second normal summon on top of an extra free body. The Zoodiac Engine most people were playing because why wouldn't you? And even throwing in a small Zombie or Shaddoll engine at times, all in service of making Lightsworn's then prize card exclusive rank 4 Minerva to help mill even more. And last, we can't talk about Grass without bringing up the Sacred 60. Paleozoic Frog was a deck that was known and played prior to the rise of Zoodiac, but it wasn't really until Joshua Schmidt's 60-card Grass version winning YCS Prague in 2017 that people realized and appreciated the deck's ability to be playing Grass, as well as its strong matchup against Zoodiac. The Zoodiac end board was one that mostly relied on disrupting face-up monsters, and when you're setting traps, have fun with that one, friend. If the deck got Grass off, it would fill the grave with Paleozoic traps and frogs. Since Paleo traps can summon themselves from the grave in response to the activation of a normal trap, this let the deck make its plays, and with Ronin Tonan's Rip to the King, every frog in the grave became a free material for even more rank 2 plays. This is my personal favorite of all the Grass variants, because unlike something such as Infernoid or Lightsworn mutt piles, Paleo doesn't need to have a huge graveyard to be making its plays. Yes, it is slower to get the ball rolling, but the trap effects of the Paleozoic cards are strong enough to disrupt plays on their own, and then on turn 2 it only starts to get better. I am heavily biased here, but an Infernoid hand without Void, Feast, or Grass is one that can lead to a very beatable field, whereas a Paleo hand without Swap, Frog, or Grass is still a set 3 pass grind. These sorts of decks were everywhere in 2017, causing Konami to limit Grass to help address that fact. That didn't kill Grass decks, however, in large part because of a spell card known as Left Arm Offering. Able to add any spell card from the deck to the hand, it has the cost of banishing the player's entire hand to activate, and you'll need to banish at least 2, so as to help prevent people from just setting spell or traps on the same turn to use it to get around and do all your cheeky plays first and abuse all your strategies. But it doesn't stop you from using the spell card you search, only setting spell and trap on the turn you activate it, so you could just hit the button and mill. So many of the strategies wanted cards in the grave more than they wanted them in their hand, so getting rid of the hand to get that win condition was never really a bad thing. As such, these same decks that were playing this card kept playing this card. You just saw a rise in the use of Left Arm Offering to search it out, to increase the odds of seeing it, and in the use of things like Desires. Desires may be getting rid of 12 cards ultimately that you'd rather have milled, but drawing 2 of those 12, hopefully seeing Grass and letting you mill at least 10, could still be enough to win you a duel. This was the case for damn near every deck talked about, still seeing play with Grass at the time that is, because rocking 60 and milling was simply that good even if the odds weren't always in your favor. It is worth mentioning, however, 2 other key things that really let Grass shine. The first one that I like to mention, I've already talked about it briefly, and that's Pot of Desires. Because while Grass decks could use it to help find Grass, plenty of other decks were playing it as well to help find their own key pieces. While the debate raged at the time and still does today about whether this card is a -9 or a +1, plenty knew that it's a +1. And if you activated Desires going first and then found out that the opponent had Grass, oh good lord. An extra 12 cards to be milled, not counting any other sort of deck thinning that you might have done in your turn 1, especially if you're playing something like, say, Zoo, and yeah, that could be brutal when facing Grass. It's not huge, it didn't apply in every duel or every deck because of the prominence of Grass, but it happened to me once and I'm traumatized, so please God, just let me vent. The other big thing that has to be talked about is of course Fairy Tale Snow. If you've been looking at each deck list I've shown so far, you've seen it in damn near every single deck that played Grass. And that's because Snow is just an insanely good card. With so many implications, it really deserves its own video. Hence why I have one that you can watch here. But in terms of specifically Grass and Grass decks, Snow really was more or less a package deal with Grass in every deck except I guess Paleo. All decks played an abundance of cards that had a use in the grave, but they played plenty of things that didn't really care to be in the grave either. Second copies of Grass, something like Brilliant Fusion or Reasoning, any spell or trap really. Milled by themselves they did nothing, but once Snow was in the grave, they became free real estate to banish and summon out Snow without using any resources from the deck's key strategies. It helped that Snow is a quick effect and a Book of Moon on summon. This meant all Grass decks playing it got a bonus way to disrupt the opponent's turn, a way to stall in the battle phase if they were maybe starting to lose, and an extra 1850 damage when attacking just because you had those excess cards in the grave. Not a bad thing by any stretch. Its versatility in decks was huge, and grass decks are the place where snow really first earned its reputation as being something of a problem card. Funny how abusable things pair so well with abusable things, isn't it? Overall, grass is a hell of a card. Before its release, 60 card decks weren't really a thing, because the closer you are to 40, the more consistent your deck is, and broadly speaking, consistency is king in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! But at the cost of some of that consistency, grass allowed the power that grave effects have to help close that gap, with some people opting to play 60 card variants of their own decks, not playing grass just to try and prevent grass decks from having that much of an edge. It was really that much of a threat. It came at its risks, of course. 60 card decks are less consistent, and opening multiple Mizuki or other cards that you only want to see in the grave and not your copy of grass did not lead to fun times. But when it plussed, grass plussed. I like to think it helped encourage people to play 60 card variants in general as well, with Orcus builds and adventure combo piles of later years going on to experiment with the 60 card builds. And regardless of whether or not it stays banned for long in the TCG, you can bet that if it ever comes off the list, you'll see a rise of decks playing this, not unlike it was in 2017, and when they pop off, you can be sure you'll be looking at their end boards and thinking, yeah, I guess the grass is always greener on the other side, isn't it? And so that's our look at Yu-Gi-Oh! Single card history. That grass looks greener. Stay tuned for our next video, and feel free to suggest some cards to review or what type of video you'd like to see. As always, don't forget to subscribe, and you can impress your smoking Italian wife and immediately become a true duelist just by hitting subscribe to YGO Strats.